Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Civitas. Today we have an incredibly episode, and we have Professor Benjamin Friedman from Harvard University. He is one of the leading professors in not only economics but
Hmm.
politics. Hello, Professor. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
So, Professor, let's start with your book from 2005. In the Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, the book Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, you said and argued that growth fosters tolerance and openness while stagnation does the opposite. Do recent political trends in slow growth economies read to you as confirmation, or the case is still complicated?
First of all, these matters are always complicated. We're talking about societal issues in which economics and economic growth or stagnation would be one of the major issues and forces at work, but certainly not the only one. But having said that, I think, yes, at least in the United States, where I'm most familiar with what's happening, I believe the last quarter century and even more recently of experience has been roughly consonant with the argument that I made in the book. The American economy has been very stagnant over the past quarter century. The growth rate has been less than 1% per annum on average in real terms for the past quarter century. At that rate, people's standard of living would not double for more than 100 years. And moreover, as you are probably aware, the trend in our country has been toward greater and greater inequality, meaning that the fruit of whatever limited growth we've had has largely accrued to people who are already at the top of the income distribution. And therefore, for the typical American citizen, the growth has been even less than what I have described. So I think this is at least one major reason why we've seen an erosion of tolerance in my country. Look at attitudes toward immigrants, look at renewed racial tensions. We've certainly had um, an, a slowdown in the rate at which our country is willing to be generous to the disadvantaged. We've had a slowdown in our willingness to provide opportunities more broadly among the population. And I think, too, we've had an erosion of the population's commitment to democratic values and democratic institutions. These are all dimensions of the society that in my book that you mentioned, The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, I argued were related to whether the broad bulk of the population was either moving forward in its material living standard or the reverse. So I think the answer is yes, broadly speaking, at least in the US, the trend of the last 2 decades, quarter century, has been consistent with that hypothesis.
European countries, for example, Germany, Italy, or even UK?
Well, here, clearly the trend has been away from these, I take it to be morally positive characteristics of the society. Look at the attitudes toward immigrants. That's the most obvious dimension here in these societies. In Germany, we've had a sharp increase in the support of this far right group, the so-called AfD, which in English translates as Alternative for Germany. In France, Mrs. Le Pen who is the leader of the far right party, is now, I believe, the leading candidate to become president of France after the next election. And although we're a long way from the next election in Britain, it looks as if Mr. Farage's party, the so-called Reform Party, is leading all of the others. So there too, I think this period of stagnation that the Western world, broadly speaking, is undergoing is having the kind of reaction that I discussed in the book. Now, I'm trying to be careful here because the precise economic record of these individual Western European countries has been not identical to that in the United States. Britain is the more extreme case. Britain, as you know, has had a very slow economic performance since the British left the EU some years ago. And so Britain, I suppose, is the country in Europe that is where it's easiest to draw the conclusion. France and Germany have been somewhat up and down, but I think it's fair to say that at least in recent years, people are very dissatisfied with the rate of economic growth in Germany too. So broadly speaking, I would say yes, these European countries are behaving in a way that's roughly consistent with the hypothesis I advanced then.
It's wonderful answer. Now we move to another topic. So your work on historical entanglement of religious and economic thought argues that economist worldviews were shaped by theology more than they realize. Uh, do you think that this theory is still actual?
Yes, it is, though in a different form, and I discussed the change of that form in the book. You're referring, I assume, to my book that came out a few years ago called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism.
Right.
The principal hypothesis that I advanced in that work is that right from the very beginning, Western economic thinking has been, modern Western economic thinking has been powerfully influenced by religious thinking. The specific place with which I began is, of course, Adam Smith. It's important to talk about Adam Smith today because, as I trust you're aware, 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations, which was the foundational text for much of modern Western economics. The argument that I made in this book is that in developing the ideas that form the basis of modern Western economics, Smith and his contemporaries were powerfully influenced by what were at that time new and fairly contended ideas in the Western in the English speaking Protestant world. What I have in mind in particular is the movement away from predestinarian Calvinism. Calvin had taught that people are unable to influence their ultimate spiritual destinies. He taught that the human character is one of depravity. Humans are unable to see the good that they are supposed to do. And this set of ideas was pretty dominant for 100 years or so, but then things started to change. And beginning in England in the latter part of the 17th century, moving on to Scotland in the first half of the 18th century, and then to my own country in the latter half of the 18th century, uh, people started to move away toward a much more benign, optimistic view of the human character, and importantly, a a more expansive view of the possibilities for human agency. And I think it was this expansive view of human agency, the opportunity for people to uh, come to a good end, both for themselves and for other people, uh, by merely acting on their own impulses, that motivated Smith in large part, and his contemporaries too. The great contribution of Adam Smith, of course, was to show how, under the right circumstances, people who were acting on no more than just their own self-interest can take actions that make not only themselves but other people too better off. I think this is quite consistent with this more expansive view of the possibilities for human agency. And Smith's contribution in The Wealth of Nations also was to show us what the conditions are under which that proposition is true, namely that people are competing in markets. Now, you asked whether this idea is still at work today, and I think it is, I said, in a different form. Some of the major Western historians of economic thought have argued that when intellectual disciplines are in their infancy, as of course economics was at that time, they're subject to influence from the outside, even in their most fundamental basic thinking, and that's what I think happened with Smith, but that as they move forward and mature, by and large, the basics, the central theory gets fixed, and the influence from outside is more one of application of policy, if you would, in economics. And I think that's what's happened. Today, I don't think economic thinking is much influenced at the theoretical level by by religious thinking. But I think the application of economics, especially to public policy, is a sphere in which religious thinking is very powerful, and we certainly see that all the time in the United States. So I think with the caveat that, as we would expect, the locus of the influence has evolved as economics has matured. I think the answer to your question is yes, the influence is still there.
Thank you for this kind of great explanation. Now we move on to more modern topic. So you've written critically about central bank independence and monetary policy communication. How do you assess the Fed's recent experience with forward guidance against your own historical framework for monetary credibility?
I have never been a believer in the effectiveness of forward guidance as practiced by central banks in the current era. I understand the motivation if we think back, for example, to the nearly 10 years, I suppose, following the 2008, 9, 10 financial uh, crisis, when the policy interest rate of the Federal Reserve here in the United States was down at zero. The central bank naturally was looking for other things to do. They wanted to have an easier monetary policy in order to stimulate the economy. Normally, the way to have an easier monetary policy is to lower the policy interest rate, but the interest rate was already at zero. And so, except for very slight variations in a few countries, you can't push the interest rate much below zero. So they were stuck on conventional monetary policy, and to their credit, they were looking for other things to do. One thing that they did that I thought was effective was to purchase in the open market bonds of long-term maturity. And if you're interested, we can talk about why and how that was effective, but I think it was. By contrast, the second thing that they tried was so-called forward guidance, meaning telling people in the economy and in the financial markets what their plans were for future monetary policy. Now, I can see that in theory this might have some effect, but I didn't think that in practice it would, and my assessment is no, it didn't. So my advice to central banks, certainly here in the United States, would not be to try to shape markets by statements about what they're going to do in the future. They should do what they're going to do. I think monetary policy is made in the on the trading desk, not in the press office. So I would be very reluctant to engage in forward guidance.
How global economic integration interacts with domestic tolerance and openness. Given the backlash against globalization over the past 2 decades, how would you update your original framework to account for trade-driven regional economic shocks that hit some communities much harder than
Hmm.
others?
Well, I think the dimension of globalization that has been most at the forefront of the reaction that we've seen to the recent stagnation of incomes for so many people has been attitudes toward immigrants. When I did the research that I reported in the 2005 book, the one on economic growth and moral consequences, one of the phenomena that I find that I had not been expecting particularly, but that I kept coming across again and again was the sensitivity to economic experience of attitudes toward immigrants. Now, I suppose it didn't surprise me a lot here in the United States because, as I'm sure you know, we are from the very beginning a country of immigrants. Everybody here either came from someplace else himself or herself, or is the pretty recent descendant of somebody who did come from someplace else. So immigrants and immigration have always been a major issue in the United States going all the way back. And sure enough, I've found that during periods historically when people in the United States have suffered protracted periods of economic stagnation, the population has turned against immigrants. Well, that didn't surprise me very much. Uh, it did surprise me. Maybe I should have known enough about the experience of these other countries I studied to have anticipated this finding, but I didn't. In the book, I looked closely not only at my own country, but at the historical experience of Britain and France and Germany. And in those countries as well, I found that attitudes toward immigrants were very sensitive to whether the broad bulk of the population was getting ahead or not. And I think that's really here today. As I'm sure you know, a centerpiece of the Trump administration's policy today is not just keeping immigrants out, but trying to deport as many as possible of the people who are here under questionable legal circumstances. The main um, the main policy program, as I understand it, of the Reform Party in the UK was Brexit, but now that Brexit is accomplished, their main policy is an anti-immigration policy. The AfD in Germany began primarily as a protest against the euro, But now that the euro currency has become more and more accepted, I think the AFD is uh, a party that puts antipathy to immigrants at the top of its list. And of course, the Front National, Mrs. Le Pen's party in France, has historically been opposed to immigrants. So I think this part of the experience is continuing right here today. And to repeat, it didn't surprise me so much for the US, but I found it very interesting to see how pervasive it was in these other countries as well.
Thank you for joining us today. It was a really great conversation, and I think you shared the most powerful and the best answers and explanations. Thank you for joining us and taking your time today.
Okay, thank you. Lots of good luck to you.
Good luck.